Good cohort here, so I say we go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is McKenna Sellers. I'm the Executive Director for Montana Renewable Energy Association, and this is our third and final legislative briefing for MREA's members and supporters. So we made it, everybody. We made it to the final stage of the legislative session. Just last week, the lawmakers voted on sine die, and now we're here to think about what's the aftermath. How have things changed in terms of the policy landscape and laws for renewables in Montana? So a little background here, this session is being recorded so that we can post it on MREA's YouTube channel and have it for reference for those who aren't able to join us. So if you're comfortable with that, that's what we're moving forward with. Otherwise, feel free to take yourself off video if you are not. If you're new to MREA, we're a membership-based organization. There we go. Focused on the advancement of renewable energy in Montana. We foster the growth of renewables for all Montanans through education, advocacy, and industry engagement. Being a membership-based organization, we rely on the support and dedication and amazing expertise of all of our members in order for MREA to be successful, and also to make sure that we have renewable energy opportunities in Montana now and into the future. So if you're new to MREA or you are not a member yet, I invite you to join. And as we move along here, I'll make sure that that link is available to you in the chat. And if you have a question of whether or not you are a member or supporter of MREA, feel free to shoot me an email and we can check up on that for you. So as a brief overview of the type of things that Montana Renewable Energy Association works on, of our goals and our programs, we host a number of educational events, including topics like the virtual Exploring Energy series, where we'll cover the basics of Solar 101, or what's the deal with microgrids, or electric vehicle deployment. This year, we've hosted some member forward-facing events, as well as the latest on distributed solar loan financing. And the beauty of MREA is that we have members from a number of different backgrounds. So we'll host educational events not only for energy industry professionals, but also for academia and everyday households, making sure that we are the bridge between the technical side of renewables and making sure that it gets off the ground and is successful in a healthy environment in our state. The advocacy side, MREA is very active in the Capitol, and that's a big part of why we're here with you this afternoon talking about our legislative recap. We're also engaged at the Public Service Commission, which is a decision-making body for utility scale, investor-owned utility energy management. And they're balancing the interests of both the company and the consumers. So MREA is very active at the Public Service Commission as well. And throughout the year, not just during the session, we make sure that we're educating lawmakers. Then industry engagement, like I said, we have members ranging from students to households to municipalities. And we also have our solar installers and other energy industry business professionals who are members of MREA. So that's a key part of what we do as well, make sure that we're responsive to those needs. So I'm going to jump right in, and to give you all an overview of what we're going to cover here, I'm going to talk about the main themes that we saw in terms of renewables throughout the legislative session, and then break it down into what are the differences and what are the takeaways for our the MREA membership and supporters to know about, in terms of like, what are the changes that we're going to see for electric vehicles? What are the changes we'll see in terms of distributed energy? And then on the utility scale side, MREA has been involved in some of that, but we've also invited our special guest speaker, Robin Arnold from Renewable Northwest and the Montana Energy Business Alliance, to speak to a few more of the large scale and utility scale renewable energy bills that they were addressing this session too. So we'll give you the overall overview there, and then we'll close up shop and answer questions. But that's the plan for where we're headed here. So themes of the session for renewable energy, I'd say that a lot of the things that we heard from lawmakers, I mean, keeping in mind that we had a Republican supermajority in both the House and Senate, that there was a whole lot of votes and decision-making that relied on partisanship. So there wasn't as much reaching across the aisle. And I'd say that overall, the narrative that we heard a number of times is related to resource adequacy and keeping the lights on. And so if you think about it, that wasn't so There wasn't a lot of resource bias behind that. Instead, what we're hearing from lawmakers is there's more people moving into the state. We're nervous that we're not going to be able to meet energy demands. How are we going to handle that? That was a huge question that I think will still be answered even after the session is over. I wouldn't say that lawmakers have solved that part and parcel, but that was something that we heard a number of times throughout the session in terms of energy, is like, how are we keeping the lights on? How are we keeping rates affordable? And then the bills that were debated related to that. In the renewable energy sphere, I still see a lot of, I would call it energy resource cherry picking, where certain resources for some lawmakers are seen as greater or better or worthy of our time and investment. And then others are not, depending on what side of the aisle or where your political stance might be. So that's something that I think lawmakers could use some education on the power of distributed generation to answer some of these resource adequacy questions that they're asking. And we see solar and renewables as a key way to do that. Another thing that we heard was the federal incentives that are coming down for renewable energy development, or the ITC tax credits for rooftop solar. Those were somewhat of an excuse to make for the proposals that came forward in the renewable energy sphere to make renewable energy development either harder or more onerous or increasing taxes. And I could see that as a recurring theme, as long as some of these federal incentives are swirling around. I could see that as justification, at least in the state, for future bills that we might see. And then last, there was some debate about clean energy and the definition of clean energy. Just at least what we saw with, at least in the Senate Republicans and the Senate leadership mentioned a number of times that they're concerned that renewable energy really isn't as renewable or isn't as clean as it comes off as. So I think that's another education point that MREA can continue to make in terms of the fact that distributed generation, there's a lot of different motivations that people have for going solar. And sometimes they are climate motivated and sometimes they are not. Sometimes they are resource and life cycle motivated, sometimes they are not. So again, I see those as themes that will come down in future sessions as we look to 2025 and even in the study in the interim. Okay, so now we're going to cover the key places that MREA put our focus during the legislative session. So what happened with distributed energy and rooftop solar? A couple of bills to note. Of course, one of our most important bills of the session was House Bill 643, would have revised net metering and degraded the value of rooftop solar credits in exchange for a larger kilowatt cap for net metered customers. This was a really important bill for us. We usually see net metering bills come up time and time again. This was the main net metering bill of the session, and we were able to defeat that bill, knowing that it was going to be a terrible trade for the industry and overall was not going to take rooftop solar in an accessible or equitable direction. So here I have the vote count. It was a very close vote. You might, if you look on the laws page for House Bill 643, you'll see that the bill was tabled right before the transmittal deadline, 13-0. But it was a very, very close vote. And here I have the vote count broken down as to how lawmakers voted on whether or not to make rooftop solar more difficult in Montana. Couple of other bills, House Bill 524. This goes along with that transparency theme. This would have required residential rooftop solar installers to add extra disclosures to their product lines, which generally isn't a bad thing, but the bad thing was the penalties. If there was any question of how residential rooftop installers were to comply with some of these laws, it would have been an unfair trade practice and heavy fines and even up to jail time, a few years in prison. So we, MREA, worked really hard to educate lawmakers and we got that bill killed. So as far as what you would expect to see in terms of distributed energy and rooftop solar moving forward, there's one good bill to keep your eyes on, and this one passed and is likely to have the governor's signature here in the next few days. House Bill 245 is the Trades Education and Training Tax Credit, which allows for trade sector industries, including solar and PV, to invest in their workforce and their employees and claim a tax credit for up to, I think, $2,000 per employee per year, up to $25,000 per year. So as the details come out for that, I'll make sure that our installers are aware of that opportunity, because I think that's a really good one for the advancement of the renewable energy workforce in Montana, and I know that we need it. A loss was Senate Bill 399 that would have enabled community solar access. So more Montanans would have the option to buy into a community solar subscription if they couldn't, for a number of different factors, install solar on their own home. Whether they were renters, or there's so many barriers sometimes that come up. And so community solar would have been another opportunity, sponsored by Chris Pope out of Bozeman. Northern Plains Resource Council led this effort, and Montana Renewable Energy Association supported. That bill got incredibly close. It was tabled on a tie vote of 6-6 in the Senate Energy and Telecommunications Committee. And we generally heard feedback that the bill design on that community solar bill was better than any that had been heard in sessions past. So I consider that a positive advancement. But in terms of the key, what you need to know for the distributed energy and rooftop solar world, we were able to push back against a lot of the bad bills that came through this session. And the one thing that's coming out that's worth noting is that House Bill 245 training and education tax credit. That's something that our installers should certainly be aware of. Okay, so I'm going to let Robin Arnold cover most of these utility scale renewables overview, but I will let you know that House Bill 454 and Senate Bill 97 were both bills that MREA was focused on, and we were able to successfully defeat with the coalition. Those bills would have added production tax credits for utility scale renewables at 5 times their current rate, and overall just would have made the development in Montana for renewables far less competitive, and those projects just wouldn't come to Montana. So we're proud of defeating those bad bills. And actually, Robin, if you are so willing, would love to have you jump in and talk about the rest of the utility scale side. Thanks.
Sure. I'll start with the few small victories that we had. I'll start by introducing myself. How about that? I'm Robin Arnold. I'm the Markets and Transmission Director for Renewable Northwest. Our mission is to decarbonize the grid in the region by accelerating the transition to renewable energy. We focus on the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, mainly the Columbia River Basin states that Bonneville Power Administration operates in. We operate at both the state level regulatory side and state level policy. So while I do markets and transmission, I also live just outside of Helena in Clancy, Montana. So I took on the Montana policy as well. And prior to joining Renewable Northwest, I spent many years at the Public Service Commission. So I was already fairly familiar with both the policy and regulatory practices in Montana. So we had a few minor wins this session. Senate Bill 274 by Senator Daniel Zolnikov revised Major Facility Siting Act decision requirements. It streamlined the permitting process a little bit by removing the requirement for DEQ to determine convenience and necessity. That's something the Public Service Commission typically does for a lot of issues, but DEQ does not for anything other than major facility siting. So it removed that requirement. It switched the timeline for when air and water quality permits are required by requiring them prior to construction of the project rather than prior to DEQ certification. And it eliminates the requirements for DEQ to make the same findings twice if the facility uses public lands or federally designated energy corridors. It still maintains all of the environmental review and public comment processes. So we viewed this as a great way to slightly streamline the permitting process. Permitting for major transmission lines can take many years, and these lines take 10 to 20 years to develop. So any place where we can streamline the process is a good win. House Joint Resolution HJ6 by Representative Katie Zolnikov was an interim study of electric power reserves. This bill was brought by the co-ops because they had a few instances where the utilities they had contracted with to deliver power were unable to because of transmission failures in the region. So they had brief or close to brief blackouts. and are looking to study how much they should be required to carry for electric power generation reserves, when those reserves should be made available to a balancing authority for transmission, and ways of alternative options to transmission customers to enable temporary reductions on load when load shedding is required. In other words, energy efficiency measures. We view this as a great opportunity for the legislature to learn more about resource adequacy issues, especially with the Western Resource Adequacy Program, which is a regional resource adequacy reserve program that is just getting kicked off in the region. It received FERC approval earlier this year. It's expected to go live by 2025 and covers a large majority of the Western region, including Northwestern Energy in Montana. So anyway, the co-ops could be involved in that as well is a great opportunity for the legislature to learn about. House Bill 212 by Representative Tassmeyer increases the business equipment tax exemption. It increases the exemption amount from the business equipment tax from $300,000 to $1 million before the tax kicks in. This isn't a major impact to developers, but does slightly impact their bottom line. And they do benefit from this a little bit. So we count that as a win. House Bill 729 by Representative Galloway also allows for advanced conductors for transmission to be treated the same way as generation side energy efficiency measures in the state. It allows the Public Service Commission to determine if an additional return on equity should be included as an incentive for utilities to install advanced conductors. As is typical for Montana, our biggest wins were the bills that did not pass. The two that McKenna already mentioned on the resource electrical production tax were by far the biggest win. Those would have added millions of dollars a year to some of the larger projects that are either currently being built in the state or planned to be built. And a lot of the developers who are planning to build the larger projects said that if the tax passed, they wouldn't build here anymore because it just no longer would be cost effective for them. And it wouldn't be competitive with anything else in the region if the tax had passed. Another one was Senate Bill 353, which was Senator Sayles' bill to revise transmission rights of first refusal. Currently, there is a right of first refusal that exists in a small sliver of eastern Montana. This would have expanded it to the entire state, and it essentially would eliminate competition for building of transmission lines. It would give the existing utilities, mainly Northwestern Energy and Montana Dakota Utilities, the option to build any transmission that would come to the state, instead of allowing for independent transmission providers to build it, which oftentimes the independent transmission providers can build it much cheaper than the utilities do themselves. Senate Bill 242 also died. It did not make it to a committee hearing. It was introduced, but was never scheduled for a hearing. It would have revised the avoided cost rate making for qualifying facilities, which are small renewable projects that are 80 megawatts or less. There is a federal requirement for utilities to purchase from qualifying facilities at an avoided cost rate. This would have required all integration costs to be included in those avoided cost rates, including balancing costs, operating reserves, load falling costs, and grid costs. This bill was brought as a response to a Supreme Court case that determined the Public Service Commission had erred by including $267 million for network resource integration upgrades for a wind project. Northwestern Energy had determined that the interconnection of that project would cause overloads on its network, and so required the building of a new 230 kilovolt line and expected the project to pay for the entire cost, even though the capacity of that transmission line was far greater than what the project itself would actually be using. The Supreme Court ruled that those costs could not be included. They did say that a portion of network resource integration upgrades could be included, but only what the project itself was incurring, not for a much larger project like an entire transmission line. So I think the sponsor of the bill may have realized that the issue was much more complicated than he realized and never actually scheduled a committee hearing, but that is just an assumption on my part. Either way, it died, so that is a good thing. On the bad side, there were a number of bills that passed that limit the ability of nonprofits to challenge MEPA decisions, prevent DEQ from considering greenhouse gas and environmental impact statements, and ban cities from passing natural gas prohibitions. None of these impact renewable development projects directly, so we did not get involved in any of these. We also expect that most of those bills will probably end up being challenged in court. So we don't think that the legislature has last say in that. We'll see what happens. Bills that died that would have been good include House Bill 755, which would have provided for public service commissioners to be appointed instead of elected. That is always a double-edged sword, but at least with appointments, there could be minimum requirements for people who are appointed. HJ 36 was an interim study of energy sector regionalization. It would have studied all of the markets and regional transmission organization developments that are happening in the region. This is an issue that may still come up in the interim. It only died because of the very sudden ending of session. Session ended before this interim study had its hearing in the second chamber. So we think there is a good chance that the members of the interim committee will still be interested in the subject and still bring it up despite not having an official study bill. Several bills were neither good nor bad, but may have an impact. House Bill 220 by Representative Kastmeyer creates a select committee on energy resource planning and acquisition. This is Northwestern Energy's response to new resource planning rules that the commission enacted in January of this year. The utilities did not like those rules because they create much more robust and transparent resource planning processes. We view this as not necessarily bad because there is a chance that if the committee appoints technical people and takes the study seriously, it could be a great education opportunity for the legislature to realize just how complicated the issue is and how the commission was not erring in the rules that it enacted. House Bill 284 by Representative Schillinger revised laws related to approval of electricity resources. This also was in response to a court case. Previously, Northwestern Energy was the only utility that had a pre-approval rule in place. It allowed them to go to the commission for pre-approval of a resource before it was actually built or used and useful. The court threw that out because it was applied only to Northwestern Energy and not the other regulated utility in the state, Montana Dakota Utilities. So the legislature came back and applied it to both utilities. There is some positive to it, however, because it got amended so that now only the initial costs that the utility is requesting approval for will receive pre-approval. Anything above and beyond that, if the project has cost overruns, the utility will have to go back to the commission for additional approval of those costs. Previously, once pre-approval was granted, it didn't matter if there were cost overruns or not. They were already considered approved, and there is nothing the commission could do about it. House Bill 170 by Representative Gunderson repeals state energy policy. This policy had some great statements about renewables and transmission. However, it also promoted fossil fuels as well. It was a little all over the place, as you can probably imagine in Montana. It was not ever cited for anything. It was just something that existed in statute and wasn't actually used as far as I could tell. So I don't think any harm was done by repealing that policy. And that is it for my section.
Thanks, Robin. That was great. One other bill, since we're throwing them all together here, is Senate Bill 147. That was a bill to establish an energy conservation standard. Was just worth mentioning that as far as renewables and MREA is concerned, the least resource intensive energy resource is the one that we should be choosing first, and that's often efficiency. Unfortunately, lawmakers didn't really connect the dots between this resource adequacy question of how are we keeping the lights on and investing more in efficiency, so that energy conservation standard proposal was shot down actually quite early in the session. But thank you, Robin. It's really nice to be able to connect the distributed and then the utility scale side and all the different dynamics between the two. But as Robin said, that often our wins are considered the bills that we are able to defeat. And overall, I think that we had an incredibly strong session this year in what we were able, the proposals that we were able to defeat, at least for those that directly impact renewables. Okay. So local governments, not quite so lucky. Few bills here that restrict and limit how much local control there is for phasing out fossil fuels and moving toward a more renewable energy transition and clean energy transition. So Senate Bill 208 and Senate Bill 228, which I believe are either signed by the governor or close to it, add restrictions to how local governments can regulate fossil fuels and anything fossil fuel related, going even as far as to where a gas station might be located or pipelines. So I think the intent behind this is related to the the Yellowstone Generating Station and the Laurel gas plant, which MREA is not involved at all with any of that project, either for or against. However, as far as the lawmakers go, I think that these bills were in response to restricting how much local governments can respond to energy zoning in their, or fossil fuel related activities in their local communities. So I see that as a loss, especially for local governments. Another bill here is House Bill 241, one that MREA was involved in, and that prevents the state building codes and the Department of Labor and Industry from adopting any building codes that would require any form of solar or EV ready, either the chargers and panels themselves or related equipment for new builds. So that was one that I think it's a preemptive bill, one that I haven't seen any local governments really seriously proposing solar on every building at this stage. However, this does prevent local governments from adopting any sort of pre-planning for reducing costs for homeowners who might have to go back and do a bunch of retrofits. And in the time where our workforce is already a bit scarce for electricians and construction workers, I think that this is going to be a disincentive for homeowners, business owners, or any building if the retrofit and the reconfiguration in order to get solar or EV chargers is just going to be that much more difficult. And House Bill 241 will continue to make that process increasingly difficult if we don't have new builds transitioning in future years. And then in the realm of electric vehicles, two bills worth focusing on. House Bill 60, if you are an EV driver or if you plan to have your EV or plug-in hybrid in the coming years, make sure you budget for some increased costs. So the registration fees in the state of Montana for electric vehicles and fully electric and plug-in hybrids is going to increase. For your plug-in hybrids, on top of your normal registration cost, you're going to see between $70 and $700 increase, just depending on the size of your vehicle. And then for those fully electric, see a range of an additional $130 to just over $1,000. And so $1,000 are for those really heavy duty vehicles too. It's split up by weight class. But those are things that I think we should certainly be aware of in Montana, that these are increased costs that consumers are going to have to budget for as they make the transition. Another bill here on the electric vehicle side, House Bill 55, which I anticipate to be signed by the governor, allows for electric vehicle charging stations to have their own, essentially their own rate class at the Public Service Commission and be charged a certain rate based on the energy consumption patterns. But on the back end, there will be a 3 cent per kilowatt hour public charging station tax on any public charging station in the state of Montana. And this is going to be a phased approach. I believe there will be a few where this is effective in July 2023, and then another round in 2025. So if you are an EV user in Montana and you use one of these public charging stations, you will be having another layer of cost on top of your registration fees. It won't be, I don't think that it will be super apparent on the consumer side, because this will be managed on the back side of the public charging station providers. However, it's something for us to be aware of. And in the year 2028, as the bill currently reads, if you're an EV driver with and you're registered in the state of Montana, your additional fees will be reduced by 30% in 2028. So it's a little bit of a balancing act that the state proposed here. Unfortunately, I see these as deterrents to electric vehicle and plug-in hybrid adoption in Montana, just because there's all these extra layers of costs. The public charging station bill, I see a little bit of good as far as being able to establish a tariff at the Public Service Commission, but there's some caveats there. Thank you. And Jess, actually, do you want to speak to the size of the chargers and what's applicable here?
Sure, yeah, the chargers in that bill are chargers over 25 kilowatts. That would typically be level 3 fast chargers. And the other thing that's not super clear in the bill states that there are chargers not installed at a residence. So theoretically, you could have a DC fast charger installed at your house and it wouldn't be taxed, but that wouldn't really happen. Pretty much all DC fast chargers that are installed at businesses. The other loophole is if the HOA owns the level 3 fast charger, I think in that case it wouldn't be taxed because that's considered a residence. And then, yeah, the as McKenna said, the Northwestern Energy or the utility provider will collect that tax, and you will be forced to install a meter upstream of that charger for them to meter the electricity.
And the pot of money that both the electric vehicle registration additional fees and the public charging station fees will go to is the road use tax, or that will all be funneled toward Department of Transportation. So those are the changes that we're seeing in all of these big groups. Before we move to, thank you, Robin, for that. Before we move into study bills and what's next, let's leave some time for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
I would mention 2 other bills that didn't pass that were tabled. There were Senate bills 541 and 508 by Mary Ann Dunwell that was proposing tax credits for biofuel production and consumption. Something like those would be needed, but they were both tabled and didn't really move anywhere.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, MREA doesn't go as deep on the biofuels front, but it is helpful to know for the big picture. Appreciate it. Okay, question from Andrew. What does your crystal ball say on big energy issues that may resurface in 2025? I certainly think that the large-scale renewable energy production tax increases are something that we'll see once again. I've already been talking with Robin and a few of the other lobbyists about that particular issue. I also see maybe some like transparency and sunlight laws around the like life cycle of solar panels, electric vehicles, and batteries as a potential thing to pop up, and how MREA approaches some of those, because we're obviously all about transparency and making sure consumers have the best upfront knowledge. Finding out how some of that could be legislated, I think, will be something we could see in 2025. Okay. David asks comment about federal incentives. Somewhat. So I think that overall lawmakers are well aware of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act incentives and rebates that are coming down for both renewable energy development and homeowner EV, solar adoption, efficiency. And so lawmakers were often using that as a justification of, oh, you guys are going to get so many of these tax breaks. We're going to be a little more hard hitting here in the state. I think that's the dynamic that I saw in terms of the general comments. And we might see a ripple effect of that in 2025. Any other questions? Sam asks, are there impacts on state level rulemaking due to restrictions on? That's a great question. As my read right now on these the climate related decisions at state agencies, there were a few bills that passed around the Montana Environmental Protection Act, or MEPA, and how DEQ is allowed to evaluate, well, basically says that the Department of Environmental Quality cannot evaluate CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions when deciding on the prudency of a project on the look before you leap, which is the MEPA policy. And so my understanding is no, I don't think that any of the DEQ rulemaking around the Inflation Reduction Act will be impacted by that, because those climate related evaluations that are no longer, or that are basically disallowed in Montana through the passage of House Bill 971 and the likely passage of Senate Bill 557, those would not relate to the federal incentives. Any other questions? Okay, Dave asks about the Public Service Commission. Robin, I might also kick this to you, but to my knowledge, I didn't see any major bills that would have restricted, or that do restrict, the powers of the Public Service Commission directly.
No, I feel like there was one bill that would have, but it ended up being tabled in committee. I think the biggest slam against the PSC was the creation of the Select Committee on Resource Planning. Northwestern Energy directly stated in their testimony in the first hearing that the Public Service Commission was incompetent, and that's why they needed the Select Committee, which probably not the wisest thing to say, because the Public Service Commission will also be sitting on that Select Committee. But that, I think, is the worst that happened to the PSC. Otherwise, they made it through fairly well this session, as far as I could tell.
Thanks, Robin. Yep, and I agree with that. Bill just asks about the Consumer Council. Overall, I didn't think that the Consumer Council had a direct presence at the Capitol as often as I have seen them in sessions past, representing the Consumer Council's position on direct bills. There was, at the very early start of the session, in the rulemaking process, there was a proposal to essentially disallow the Consumer Council from weighing in on bills. That did get taken out, and that was not put in the final rules, but I think that the effect was clear, where the Consumer Council was much more conservative in how often they weighed in on bills and legislative proposals. So I just didn't see them as often. In terms of like how they fared from the start of the session to the end, it's I'd call it nothing gained, nothing lost. There's 3 staff at the Public Service Commission right now, and a few of them are new, and they are very involved in the rate case, the Northwestern Energy rate case, as well as every other case that goes, the contested cases that go before the PSC. Yes, good point here. And this is an excellent segue into talking about study bills and what's happening next. So for the first time in MREA's history, we will be putting together a legislative scorecard. So keep your eyes out for the digital version of the scorecard early summer 2023, and we'll have some printed versions available at the Montana Clean Energy Fair in Billings this summer in August. But overall, what we're planning on doing there is connecting the dots on a few key bills and letting the consumers and people who care about renewable energy in Montana see how their lawmakers voted on the bills that matter most to renewable energy in Montana and what mattered most to MREA. So if you've seen these from other nonprofits, they are pretty common, and we're excited to connect the dots here between renewable energy education, not only with the general public of Montana, but also with lawmakers, which is something that we've worked on since our inception. But looking at study bills, Robin did mention that there's two bills kind of coming out that will be parsed out for most certain during the interim. That House Bill 220, which is the special committee on resource planning and acquisition that was requested by Northwestern. The positions of who will be serving on that special committee are still being parsed out, but because that bill passed, that's for sure happening during the interim. And then whatever report comes out of that special committee will be given to ETIC, which stands for Energy and Telecommunications Interim Committee. It's basically the lawmakers that want to focus on energy policy issues in between sessions. Couple of bills that, and then House Joint Resolution 6 about energy reserves. That was sponsored by Katie Zolnikov. I envision MREA being involved in that one. And it, as Robin said, is a good opportunity to talk about resource adequacy in light of how renewables and, in our view, dispatchable distributed power is something that could be of benefit to that study. A couple other issues that didn't make it through in the study bill side, pumped hydro study, a study on energy sector regionalization, a study on the energy impacts of cryptocurrency, and actually a study on consumer-owned utility, the creation of consumer-owned co-ops. So while those study bills did not officially pass during the session, once the interim committees come together, they have a lot of authority in determining what they would like to study over the interim and how they parse out their time. So those were the topics that were brought up during the session in terms of energy that would have a relationship to renewables. And I could see some of those coming back up during the interim, and MREA will be involved in those. One major change, usually during the interim, so in between legislative sessions, so between now and January of 2025, the interim committees were typically split equally across party lines. So you'd have equal Republicans and equal Democrats and a mix between the House and the Senate working on these interim committees and doing these studies that will eventually lead to bill proposals, oftentimes. But there was a bill this session that changes that 50-50 split to it's actually now going to be a 3-to-1 majority to minority. So I think that changes some of the dynamics of the interim, and whether or not it will change the dynamics of renewable energy related discussions or ETIC remains to be seen. But that's something that we'll be seeing between now and 2025. Okay. Well, that concludes our legislative recap. I hope that you all learned a lot and enjoyed. And I would like to ask you that MREA's work at the Capitol, often playing a lot of defense to make sure that we have fair, reliable, and equitable renewable energy policies in the state of Montana, takes a lot of work, takes a lot of resources. So I'm asking you, if you are not yet a member of MREA, I encourage you to join. And if you can't join right now, get on our mailing list. Make sure that you are in the know about the important policies that are coming across our desk, and then also happening not only in the halls of the Capitol, but statewide. So that QR code there, if you scan that, that will lead you to MREA's membership and donation portal. And so if you're willing to be a member today, I'd really encourage it. And we would really appreciate your support so that we can continue to do this hard work at the Capitol. There's my email address if you have any follow-up questions. And I'd be remiss if I didn't do a promo for Montana Clean Energy Fair. MREA hosts this in-person event every summer. This is our 12th annual Clean Energy Fair and the first time that we are bringing it to the Magic City, Billings, Montana. So save the date for that. There's also a QR code there if you'd like to save it. We are open for exhibitors and sponsors at this time. So if you're an attendee, great, love it. Please share it with your friends. If you know of any companies, organizations, or entities that would like to be involved on the exhibitor side of the Clean Energy Fair, we'd certainly love to have them.